Okay, so we've looked at these services in the past several clips. Now let's take a brief look at these other services that are not used very often. And we'll start with the interpolate service. The interpolate service is used internally by the compile service in Angular, and it is not something you will typically need to use directly, but it is useful to know that you can modify the interpolate service. For example, some JavaScript frameworks use the same double squiggly delimiters that Angular does, and sometimes this can cause a conflict between the two JavaScript frameworks. And so you can modify the delimiters that are used in Angular expressions by modifying the interpolate provider. And you can do that when configuring your module. And you simply inject the interpolate provider and then call start symbol and end symbol on that provider and give it the characters that you want to use for delimiting Angular expressions. And in this case, we're using the double square brackets. So that's really all there is to the interpolate service, and it's good to know that you can modify those if you need to. The log service is just used for diagnostic logging and debugging, and it has 4 methods on it that you can call: log, info, warn, and error. And those just provide different types of output to the console log. So again, this is just used for debugging typically. Now the root scope is used throughout the application, mostly behind the scenes. And there is one root scope per Angular application, and it is used whenever a new scope is generated. So whenever you create a controller, a new scope is created from the root scope, and it prototypally inherits from the root scope, which means that you can put properties on the root scope or methods, and those become available to you in all your other scopes. But be careful that your root scope doesn't become just a dumping ground for global data. The root scope is injectable into controllers and services, although you won't typically need to use it, and it's kind of a best practice to avoid using the root scope if you don't need to. And there may be cases where you need to use it, but just be aware that if you're using root scope frequently, there might be better ways to do what you're trying to do. All right, the last services that we're going to look at are the 3 services that give you access to the DOM, and that is the window, document, and root element services. The window service and document service give you access to what you think they would, the window and document JavaScript objects. And they're provided as a service so that if you do have to use them, you can inject them, and when you're writing unit tests, you can inject mocks of them, and it doesn't become a problem to use them in your code. It doesn't cause problem in your tests. And the root element is similar, but it gives you access to the Angular root element, which is whichever element you put your ng app directive on. That becomes the root element. So these services just allow you to have access to those DOM elements. But it is really not a good practice to use these. Most often you can get away with not doing any DOM manipulation directly in Angular, and instead you manipulate the DOM through data bindings. So if you find yourself needing to use any of these elements, consider whether you could use them through other means that are more consistent with the Angular way. And that pretty much covers all of the built-in services that come with Angular, except for those few that will be covered in the routing and testing modules. All right, one last quiz for this module. Which service would you modify if you want to change the double squiggly expression delimiters? The interpolate provider. And you do this during the configuration phase of the application. How many root scopes are there in an application? There is just one root scope, although there are many child scopes. Can child scopes access items on the root scope? Yes, this is made possible through prototypal inheritance.